Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers here in Winnipeg. We're broadcasting tonight live from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm so pleased that you could all join us tonight virtually in this space to celebrate an excellent book. We're here to celebrate Lost on the Prairie by MaryLou Driedger, published by Wandering Fox, an imprint of Heritage House. And I'd like to start right out of the gate by thanking Heritage House for helping bring this evening together, and of course, for publishing this volume in the first place. We have an excellent evening ahead of you with a wonderful host. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get everything underway. You'll notice that there is a chat, so please do feel free to chat amongst yourselves, offer any words of encouragement or positive feedback you might have throughout the evening. Although the authors won't necessarily be looking at the chat right now, I will be sure to send them a copy afterwards, so MaryLou and Harriet can see all the lovely things that you have to say. I'll also point out that there'll be time for questions from all of you at around the close of the evening. So please do feel free, as questions occur to you, write them in the Q&A box that you'll find just at the bottom of the screen. Keeping all of the questions in the Q&A box will make sure that your host for this evening can easily locate them all when it does come time to interrogate MaryLou. Finally, I'd like to point out that copies of Lost on the Prairie are available from McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can order them online, you can give us a call, you can also visit us as well, now that we are open to the public once again. So please do feel free to stop by and pick up a copy of this book. We also mail copies locally, nationally, and internationally. So if you want this book, we'll find a way to get it to you. But that's it for me right now. Right now, I have the pleasure of introducing your wonderful host for this evening, our good friend, Harriet Zaidman. Harriet is a children's writer and book reviewer based here in Winnipeg, who worked as a teacher librarian for 25 years. Her debut middle grade novel, City on Strike, was published in 2019 and came highly recommended by CM Magazine, was also shortlisted for the Jeffrey Bison Award for Historical Fiction for Young People. Harriet's second novel, Second Chances, comes out this fall. So please join me in virtually welcoming Harriet Zaidman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, John, for starting us off. It's just a real honor to be able to be the host for this evening. And to introduce MaryLou Driedger and her very, very lovely novel, Lost on the Prairie. I quite enjoyed it. It was a treat to read. I've read it several times. I only met MaryLou last year. She got in touch with me because she discovered we had a person in common, Burl Young, who wrote Miles to Go, which is also published by Heritage House. A beautiful novel I'd also recommend. And so she got in touch and we hit it off right away. And I was really thrilled when she contacted me and asked me to be the host for the launch tonight. So let's get on with it. Who is MaryLou Driedger? She is our author. She has a breathtaking CV. And if you go online and look on her site, it's even more extensive. I'm going to give you a sort of a cook's tour of her CV, but it's pretty extensive and admirable. She was a teacher for 36 years in K-12 rural and urban settings. She was on committees, she developed programs, she was a workshop leader and a mentor. She was the Manitoba Teacher of the Year in 1998, which we know is always based on real accomplishments. She then taught high school English and journalism at an international school in Hong Kong for over 6 years. She, upon return to Canada, became a faculty advisor in the Faculty of Education from 2012 to 2020. And then she was also a tour guide at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. She is a member of the Steinbach Library Board, chaired a committee to build a reading garden there. She wrote the history of the Steinbach Library, and she's on the Winnipeg Library Board as well. Since 1985, she has been writing constantly. She's written hundreds of articles that have appeared in newspapers, magazines, books, professional journals, and travel websites. She was a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press for 3 years, but she's been writing steadily for the Steinbach Carillon for 36 years. She's a member of multiple writing and arts organizations. She has a personal blog called What's Next. It's on social media. It's meditations on a wide variety of topics, and some of them are often sparked by a photo or an object that brings back memories and causes her to reflect on a contemporary issue as well. They're very enjoyable. I always look forward to reading them. She's a member of the Anita's writing group. She turned her attention to writing for children. She took courses and joined this writing group so she could build her skills. And that leads us to today, because now she can add children's author to her list of accomplishments. Lost on the Prairie is a novel that fits into a few genres. It's historical, it's a coming of age novel, it's an adventure novel. And I would like to add, from a writer's point of view, it's thoroughly researched, skillfully and sensitively written. She's going to tell us about her inspiration now and how she crafted the novel. So welcome, MaryLou.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for letting me read all that. I mean, that's quite a CV. And welcome. And we're all anxious to hear about your novel and what brought you to write it. So tell us how you came to write this book.
Well, maybe I'll start with that, and then I'll read a little bit from the book as well. So it all started actually in 2014. And I was helping my Aunt Viola, who lives in Saskatoon, move into a personal care home. And as I was going through her papers, I found a memoir that had been written by my great aunt Elma. I'd never met my great aunt, but the second paragraph of her memoir kind of caught my attention, because she was writing about my grandparents' immigration journey, my great-grandparents' immigration journey to Canada in 1907. They came to Saskatchewan from Kansas. And my great aunt said that 3 of her brothers had been traveling in boxcars with the family horses. And when the train arrived in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, the boxcar that my grandfather had been traveling in was gone. And she didn't say in the memoir, what had happened to Grandpa. So I was really curious. Like you said, Harriet, I've been a newspaper columnist for 5 years. And if you're going to write a newspaper column every week, you have to be curious because you've got to find things to write about. Yeah. So I went online and I looked at the type of, what kind of train companies would have been running in 1907. And I looked for the possible route that my grandfather's train could have taken. And I had been working at becoming a children's writer for quite a while. And when I started putting all those things together, I thought, wow, this might make a really interesting middle grade novel. And so that's kind of what sparked it.
Wow. Interesting, hey? So a small thing can spark.
It was.
Yeah. So how did you know you were on the right track when you were writing it?
Well, you mentioned I belong to this wonderful group of children's writers, the Anitas, and before the pandemic, we actually met at McNally Robinson's every other week to read our work to each other. And when I started reading this novel to them, the chapters I was writing, they were really encouraging. They said, MaryLou, this is some of the best stuff you've ever written. And I think it was Suzanne in our group who just said, don't even bother editing, just write this story. You've got to get this story down on paper. And so, that's what I did. And I think another thing that probably why I really kept on going with it was because my grandfather, Peter Schmidt, who's at the center of the story, died when I was only 7. He was killed in a car pedestrian accident in Calgary. And so I never really got to know him. And as I was researching the book and reaching out to people who might have known him and learning more about what his life might have been like, I found out he was a great whistler and that he liked to listen to radio shows and he had a great singing voice. And he was often acted as the auctioneer in his community when they were doing fundraising things. He drove a road grader. I was learning all these things about him that I didn't know. And so I think that really kept me going too, because I was getting to know my grandfather, because I hadn't really had a chance to do that when I was a kid. So
Interesting. Okay, that's great. Okay, so writing is not a linear process. You don't just dash off a story. So how did you deal with it when you got stuck?
well, normally when I get stuck, I just leave what I'm writing and then I, go off and live my life, and something that I see or hear or experience will trigger something. But there were two times I got really stuck when I was writing this. And the one time was I had decided that a really good place for Peter to have some adventures would be on the Sisseton-Wahpeton First Nation in South Dakota. And I, read about the history of the Sisseton-Wahpeton, and I looked at pictures, but I just wasn't coming up with a lot of ideas. And then my husband, Dave, planned this wonderful trip to Sisseton, South Dakota, so that I could do research. And he reserved a bed and breakfast in a little rambling old farmhouse. And there was a lady living there named Betsy. And she was so excited about the fact that I was writing a novel, maybe set in their area. She invited a bunch of local historians over for coffee. She baked muffins. She had them at the kitchen table telling me all about the history of the area. And then I went to the library in Sisseton. And don't you think that they had on microfiche newspapers from 1907? So I could look through them and see what was going on in the area at the time. And I visited the tribal headquarters. And this Betsy also arranged that I spent a couple hours talking with Naomi Parker. She's a Sisseton-Wahpeton elder who grew up on the First Nation there. So, and then Dave and I just went exploring in the area, and that's how I found places like Sika Hollow and Enemy Swim Lake and the hill that Peter and Joe Klein, we explored all those places, and then I had lots to write about when I got home. There was one other time I got really stuck, and there's a big barn fire in the book, and I had started this big fire in the book, and they were digging trenches to try and stop it, and the mom was cutting down the crops so the whole field wouldn't start on fire, and I think the girls were all putting soaking sheets and putting them on the house. And I thought, I've started this huge fire, and how am I going to put it out? So I was going for a walk with my brother Ken, and I was telling him about this, and he said, "MaryLou, it has to rain." And so well, I thought, why didn't I think of that? So my brother helped me out of that particular plot dilemma. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting where these answers come from. So did you enjoy writing the first draft or editing? What's your preference?
Well, I really liked editing more because I'm kind of a people person. And in the editing, I got to work with other people. Mm-hmm. So that was great. So my first editor was actually Deborah Fraze, who is a member of the Anitas, and she's a professional editor. She's taught children's writing at Red River. And she was really helpful in sort of fleshing out my characters, helping to make Peter more adventuresome. I even cut a few characters out, so she really helped me kind of improve the characters in my story a lot. And then after Heritage House had bought the manuscript, I worked with Nandini Thacker at Heritage House, and she was marvelous. And I really liked getting to know her. She, helped me. Like, I have a roller coaster accident in the book, and the first time she read it, she said, MaryLou, that's an engineering impossibility, the way you've written it. So, I went back and rewrote that. And also she was helpful as a sounding board. Like, there's some places in the novel where I was, like, there's a dad in the novel who's an alcoholic. And, I wanted to write those that stuff sensitively, so that if there were children reading the novel whose parents were struggling with an addiction, that, I would write that in a way that was sensitive to what was going on in their life. And so Nandini was a good sounding board for those kinds of, for those kinds of things as well. And then Lara Kordick, who was the acquisition editor who actually bought my manuscript, she's the one who came up with the idea that we should have the study guide at the end. And that I've written, I think, 12 or 14 curriculums. So it was really fun to write that. And I tried to come up with lots of really interactive, fun things for kids to do.
Yeah.
And Nandini really helped me too to to refine that and make it interesting and accessible and concise. Oh, and I also have to say a big thank you to Jackie Thomas, because she's the woman who designed that beautiful cover for the book, and it helped with designing the book itself. And I got to know Jackie, visited with her on the phone and got to know her, so that was really great too. So yeah,
it's a very suitable cover.
yes.
The horizon,
Mhm.
the rail lines, and the color green, because that's
Yeah.
the color, the prairie colors. Yeah. Okay, so the story begins with a very poignant personal family tragedy. So would you share with us your own family story and how it represents the experiences of many families when the European settlers came?
Yeah, the story actually starts with Peter's older brother Herman dying, and that just before they're going to leave for Canada, a few months before. And that's actually something that's like, this is a fictional book, but many things are true. And it's true that my grandfather's older brother Herman did die just a few months before they were going to leave for Canada. And so then when I was writing about Herman's death and his burial, I actually drew on a couple other sort of tragedies in our family to write that. When my dad was just a young teenager, his grandmother was killed in a really tragic accident near Plum Coulee, Manitoba. She was a passenger in a car that was hit by a train, and she was killed instantly. And my dad was just a teenager, but he had to help dig his grandmother's grave. And he told me that it was so cold that the ground was frozen, and they had to bring wagon loads of hot coals to put on the ground to thaw it out so that they could dig his grandma's grave. And so I used that experience from my dad, when I was describing how they dug Herman's grave in the book. And then also, when my mother was 16, her grandmother, who had lived with them since the day my mom was born, also passed away. This is 1941. And I asked my mom, I said, what did your grandma die of? And she said, well, MaryLou, we didn't have any doctors. She said, my dad called the postmaster because he did a little doctoring. And he came over and looked at grandma and just said, oh, must have been her heart. And so I put that in the book too. And I guess I wanted to show how, at the turn of the century on the prairies, families did not have doctor's help or medical help at all. And even there were no funeral directors or, so beginning and end of life events were handled by families. And I wanted to show that in the book. And also in the book, like Alvin, Peter's younger brother, has epilepsy. And that's true too. My grandpa had a younger brother named Alvin who had epilepsy. And in the book, the mom has no medications. She has no doctors to help her. She's had to figure out for herself how to deal with her son's seizures and his epilepsy. And so I guess, I wanted to keep that in the book because it really does show what life was like and how people had to handle a lot of their own medical care at the turn of the century on the prairies. So, but a lot of those things stemmed from family experiences. Yeah.
Very good. Well, you've made good use of them. So you paid attention to consulting with Indigenous people to show their reality at the time. So talk to us, tell us about how you painted the picture of the life there and how life was changing for First Nations in those years surrounding this journey.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The Sisseton-Wahpeton First Nation is so different than many other First Nations in the United States. And I found that very fascinating. So first of all, when I finished writing the manuscript, I got in touch with Dr. Sherry Johnson. She's the education director for the whole Sisseton-Wahpeton First Nation. She's in charge of all the schooling from nursery school to the college they have on the First Nation. And she appointed a cultural reader for me, Winona Starlight Burley, to read my manuscript and give me advice about whether I had portrayed the Sisseton-Wahpeton people in a correctly and in a culturally appropriate way. And I remember when Winona phoned me after she'd read the manuscript, and I was so happy because the first thing she said was, oh, I just loved your book, MaryLou. And so that made me really glad. But she also gave me like lots of ideas for things that I could change to make the manuscript more appropriate. Like just a tiny thing, like in the novel, I have Mr. Little Thunder rescuing Peter, and I say that he's wearing a leather vest with animal fur on it. And Winona said, oh, no, 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 no. At that time, a Sisseton Wapton man would have been wearing a leather vest with a floral design made with porcupine quills. And so, okay, you know, I could change that. And another time I remember, I have this scene where Peter and Joe walk up to the top of a high hill and they're looking out. And in the initial manuscript, I had Joe say, this is Sisseton Wapton land as far as the eye can see. And then Peter said, oh, it's quite a kingdom. And Winona said, MaryLou, like a Sisseton Wapton person would never say, this is Sisseton Wapton land as far as the eye can see, because we don't believe we own the land. We share the land with every living thing on it. And they'd never refer to it as a kingdom, you know. So that was great. I rewrote that scene because I wanted it to be authentic. And so I have lots of other examples like that, of things she helped me change. And then the other thing that's really interesting is that a lot of the Indigenous groups in the United States had to start sending their children to residential school like in the 1880s already. But the Sisseton Wapton did not have to send their children to residential school till 1908. They were one of the last groups that had to. And so when Peter is on the Sisseton Wapton First Nation in 1907, the children are still all living at home with their families. And so that's why Joe, his good friend, is living at home with his family. And in 1867, when Gabriel Renville, that was the Sisseton elder who made the treaty agreement with the United States, he made an agreement that there would be schools at regular intervals all over the First Nation land that they were being granted. And the United States government honored that, which meant that the kids there had access to a day school that they could go to, which is why why Joe and Mr. Little Thunder speak both English and Dakota. And, you know, because they had schools. And I think I even say in the book that Mr. Little Thunder's father claimed land close to the school so that his kids would be able to go to school. So those are some things. There's lots of other really interesting things about the Sisseton Wapton, but that I learned while I was writing the book. But those are a couple that just sort of apply to the book. So,
well, that's very interesting. That's really actually very important history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so you also include a very important literary figure at the time, Mark Twain, this towering figure in world literature, but he proves to be a very vulnerable character, rather sad, and not mythic. So talk to us about why you did that.
Well, it kind of was an accident. Like I knew that Peter on his journey home would have to stop in Minneapolis because he had to switch over to the CPR line there, you know. So I thought, well, let's have him stay there for a night and have an adventure. And so I researched what hotels were close to the Minneapolis train station in 1907. And the West Hotel was right close there. And it's not standing anymore, but in 1907, it was the place to go. And then I started reading about the history of the hotel, and I found out, ooh, Mark Twain was a frequent guest of the West Hotel. So why not, you know, maybe put him in the story? But then I started reading biographies of Mark Twain, and I found out that in 1907, he was in a sorry state, so to speak. He was drinking a lot, he was gambling, he wasn't writing at all. And part of the reason for that is his wife had died. One of his children had died of diphtheria. One of his children had had meningitis. Mm-hmm. And so his only remaining daughter had epilepsy, just like Peter's brother. And so, you know, there were a lot of reasons for him to be unhappy. And I think Peter really realizes in that, you know, the scene with Mr. Twain that, you know, you can be rich and famous and still have a lot of the same problems that his family had, that Peter's family had, you know. And I think in that scene, I even have him say a little prayer for Mr. Twain before he goes to sleep, that, you know, something happy will happen to Mr. Twain.
Now, you are going to read And
Oh, yes.
we've sort of been talking. So why don't you read the
Mhm.
passage that you were talking about?
Okay, I will do that. I just want to say before that, though, that you know, I didn't write this book to be kind of like about a lot of social problems. That's not how I set out. I wanted to write a really good adventure story. But as I was writing it, like I came, like as Peter realizes with Mark Twain, I came to realize that a lot of stuff that Peter had to deal with in 1907, children are still dealing with now. You know, like kids are still being separated from, immigrant children are still being separated from their parents on immigration journeys. Peter's mother has a period of depression after her son dies. Kids nowadays, some of them have to deal with that too, or a sibling with a medical problem, or, you know, Peter says goodbye to his grandpa and knows he won't see him for a long time. And I know from my work in inner city Winnipeg schools and talking to children like from Syria and the Philippines and China, that they too know what it's like to be separated from a grandparent, you know. So there were lots of things that I found, more and more things that Peter was experiencing that I thought kids today will know exactly what that's about. And I'm hoping as they read about how Peter met those challenges, it'll be encouraging to them. So yeah, okay. So I'm going to read from a part where Peter has his car has become uncoupled. He tries to get out and he falls down a ravine and he's really badly injured. And he realizes that he's going to have to go for help. So he's taking his horse, Prince, and he's going to go and look for some help. It's a real nice fall day, not cold like yesterday morning. The friendly sun and my aching body get the better of me. So I lay my head down on Prince's scraggly mane as he plods on. I doze off a bit, rocked by the rhythm of Prince's steady steps. My head jerks up when Prince comes to a sharp stop. We're on the top of the ridge I saw in the distance from the train tracks, and below us, on the other side, is a lake as big and blue and beautiful as our flax field in full bloom. Land's sake, look at all that water, I say to Prince. I run my dry tongue over my peeling, puckered lips and imagine how good a drink is going to taste. Prince can't be hurried no matter how much I say, go on, boy. He just plods forward down the gently sloping side of the rocky ridge towards the lake. I figure it must be late afternoon when we arrive at the shore. I slip off Prince's back and drop to the ground, stiff, sore, and plumb tuckered out. Prince clomps right up to the lake and sinks his muzzle into its blue depths, sucking up the water and swallowing it in huge, gusty gulps. After a bit, he rears his head up and swooshes water around in his mouth, streams of it pouring down from his teeth and tongue. I'm not sure I have the strength to walk to the water, so I roll my body towards it, lying lengthwise like a log, and plop in with a big splash. The cold shoots through my limbs as I try to stand up. I'm thinking how fine the water feels on my sores and cuts when I realize this lake doesn't slope gentle-like towards the middle. It's deep, right at the edge. My toes can't touch bottom, and I don't really know how to swim. I splash my achy arms as my head sinks beneath the water. I manage to push myself up once, then twice, but the third time my head drops like a stone, and I no longer have the strength to clear the surface. I begin to drift down towards the bottom of the lake. The water's clear and I can see fish and rocks and seagrasses. I'm floating like the hot air balloon at the Omaha amusement park, except I'm in the water instead of the sky. I feel real peaceful like, and not even fretful about the fact that I'm probably going to drown. I close my eyes and I imagine I am Harvey in Captain's Courageous, floating alone at sea after he has fallen off his father's ship. And suddenly I feel something grab my arm, and then a pair of legs clamp tight around my waist the way that copperhead wrapped its mouth tight around the baby gopher. I'm pulled up, 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 and I open my eyes and see a brown back, a long black braid, and a pair of arms slicing through the water like birds' wings, pushing back the air to fly forward. And maybe I'll leave it there.
Very good. So your imagery is great. Your rich vocabulary, your phrases are just beautiful.
Oh, thanks, Harriet.
Right there. I loved it. Yeah. Okay. So in Winnipeg, Peter's introduced to a different world when he arrives in Minneapolis. It's quite a different society. So why did you want Peter to see that side of society?
Well, he stays in this big fancy hotel. And I guess I wanted him to see, there's this whole big world out there. He's lived in a small little town for his whole life, and he doesn't really know anything about the wider world. And in this hotel, he sits down at a dinner table, and there's all these different pieces of cutlery, and he hears a woman in the lounge singing a popular song, and he sees women with parasols and men with top hats, and he's just astounded. And I think the thing that is most astonished by is he gets in this bathtub and he turns on the taps and all this hot water comes gushing out. And he thinks about how, when it's bath time at home, he and his mom pull this tin tub from the porch into the kitchen, and she heats water up on the wood stove, and they fill up the tub. And then everyone in his family takes turns dipping into the water, never changing it in between. And it's pretty cold by the end. And so he can't believe that there's actually something like a tub where hot water just keeps coming out. But, at the same time, he thinks, oh, I wish I could share all this with my family. Like, even as he's experiencing all these wonderful new things, he's thinking about his family, and he's missing them and wishing he could be with them, and realizing that, all of this stuff is great, but he really wishes he could be sharing it with his family. So, yeah.
Nice connection there. Okay, and so then he gets to Winnipeg. It's the last big stop on the way, but he has quite a different treatment at the CPR station. It's pretty negative. So elaborate to us, please, why he's treated so gruffly.
Well, it's not only him. I think he's actually, in the end, as soon as they find out that he speaks English, and he's traveling first class on the train. Then the whole attitude changes towards him. But so one of the things I wanted to show in the train station is like how many immigrants were coming to Canada at the time. And that CPR train station here in Winnipeg, which is still standing on Higgins Avenue. And I'd love to, now it's a vaccination clinic, which is wonderful. But when it's not anymore, then I'd like to go in there and just actually take photos of some of the things I have in the book. But that train station was built in 1906. And so when Peter arrives there, it's brand new and it's just magnificent, marble and a huge clock and all these things. But it also has a hall attached to it called Immigration Hall, and up to 400 immigrants can spend the night there, waiting. They're waiting to find out what piece of land the government has assigned to them. And there's just masses of people. And yes, the officials are quite rude to them. And Peter realizes, well, like, no wonder these people don't understand what anybody's saying to them, I guess I wanted to, like, in my family, I come from two different immigrant experiences. My mother's family came to Canada from the United States, and they had been in the United States since the 1880s. So they could speak English. They knew all about the culture of North America. And my father's family came from the Ukraine in the late 1920s and didn't speak English and didn't know about the culture here. And I think their adjustment was much more difficult, and they were treated much more harshly. And I kind of wanted to show that disparity in the novel. I was thinking about, one of my cousins told me about taking my grandpa across the border one time after he'd been in Canada, probably 30 years already. He was a very successful farmer. He was a community leader, but he still spoke with an accent. And the border official was really rude to my grandpa because, they were treating him like an immigrant who's still couldn't speak English properly. And so that maybe was in the back of my head, that there were different immigrant experiences depending on where you came from. And so I wanted to kind of show that in the train station with Peter. Yeah. Yeah.
Very well. Well, those are my questions, I think. I'm just going to go through. I think I'm done my questions. So what I'm going to do is open it up, go into the Q&A. We had a question submitted already by Virginia Martin. So she's asked, you have keen readers here. She asked, why in Minneapolis does Mark Twain not have vegetables on his plate? Is that what the menus, it's a reason.
Yeah. I got that question ahead of time, so I was thinking about that. And maybe there were vegetables on the plate. I guess I just mentioned meat and potatoes as being, and I think I said that Peter had ice cream for dessert. I was thinking about that. It was fall, so maybe they would have had, fresh vegetables handy. Maybe I should have put them on the plate, but I just didn't think of that. So
And she's wondering also, were there no cabooses? Like, how did the train actually get lost? How did the
Yeah, well, I thought, I'm glad I knew that, had that question ahead of time too. So I looked it up, and trains started having cabooses about in the 1870s, or that's the first time it's recorded, like written down that they did. But after that, some trains that were passenger trains did not have cabooses. All freight trains did. And some trains that were freight trains and passenger trains did not have cabooses either. So I was thinking that, maybe Peter's train had both passenger cars and freight cars. But, another thing you have to remember, this is a novel, it's fictional. And I don't know what happened to Grandpa's train car. And it could be even that the caboose came off the train too with Grandpa's car. Like, obviously, if it became uncoupled, it was near the end of the train, but I don't really know. But it was interesting to explore that. And I'm, hoping as I talk to more people about the novel, you'll have lots of questions that I can explore more. So, yeah.
Or it may have been shunted off onto a siding. They may have had to recouple the train.
Yes, for sure.
Things like that. Okay, here's a question from Jody Carmichael. She said, how many hours a day do you write between novels, blogging, and newspaper columns?
Oh, well, more during the pandemic than I did before. So I have been I'm finished another novel now, actually, because I've had a lot of time to write during the pandemic. I had 2 jobs. Like you said, I worked at the art gallery and the university before the pandemic. And now I don't have those jobs. So I do write now many hours a day. So
very good. Okay. And Kelly Weiss would like to know, she keeps thinking about Peter's mother. What do you imagine her month was like while she was waiting for Peter to make it back to her?
Oh, hi, Kelly. Kelly's from Chicago. She's an old friend. I'm so glad you're here. I think it must have been terrible for her, but because she'd already lost one son, and now she's, she doesn't know what's happened to this son either. But I think we have to keep in mind that, that was a reality of those times. Like, people lost a lot of their children. But in my aunt's memoir, the line she writes is something like, when my mother saw that Peter's train car was gone, you can imagine her consternation, I think, is what my great aunt writes, and I'm sure that consternation continued until the two, until they found Peter and they were reunited with him. So, yeah. But yeah, it's hard to imagine what a mother thinks when they don't know. It kind of reminds me of Kelly as a friend from Hong Kong. And when I lived in Hong Kong, I used to go a lot to visit a cemetery there where there were a lot of soldiers from Winnipeg buried. And I used to think about their mothers too, how in the 1940s, here were their sons were far, far away in a place they couldn't even imagine what it looked like. And, and it's how all mothers feel when they're separated from their kids, and they're trying to imagine what's happening to them, and they don't know. Anybody who's a mom knows how scary that is. So.
Debbie Jackson wants to know how you chose some of the names you used. Euphemia, Eudora, Violet from your Aunt Viola. How did you choose?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, some of the names I used people from my family, like, Peter and Herman and Alvin. Those are real people in my family. But it's so easy nowadays. I just looked up, you can Google what were popular names in 1910. And then some of the names just came from, I've done a lot of reading set in this time, and so I just thought of names from that. And yeah, I have a genealogy of my grandpa's family, like going back for many, many generations. I have a book. So I looked in there for names. And actually, I sometimes I find it quite interesting to read obituaries in the paper, because there's a lot of names in there. It's a really good place to look for names too. So those are some name sources.
Yeah. Okay. So Aaron F. asks, in the 35 plus years of writing, what's the biggest thing you've learned about writing?
Wow. Well, that there's always new things to try. you know, like I've done all different kinds of writing. I've done curriculum writing, and I write for the Mennonite Church. I write a series of devotional things every year for them. I've written curriculums. I've written, you know, I did a lot of travel writing when we were living in Hong Kong, and now I'm trying children's writing. So that would be a big thing. But I guess, you know, writing is just my way of making sense of the world, you know, like figuring things out. It helps me to process things and keep a record of things. So yeah.
Carolyn Jansen asks, might you put Peter in another book with other additional adventures?
Well, you know, a couple people have asked me that. I hadn't really thought about it. Some people think I have said, well, you need to take up from, you know, when he arrives in Drake and write about his life there. And I thought about that. I've actually just finished, the first draft of a novel called 60s Girl, which is kind of based on my growing up period in the 1960s. And I have been toying with the idea of actually writing a story about my mother's childhood in the 1930s in Saskatchewan, but who knows? This is my first novel, and I'm so thrilled with how many people have read it. So maybe I will do another Peter story. I don't know.
So Melanie Matheson, pardon me, I'll just say this one. Dora Dewitt says she hasn't had a chance to read it yet, but she's curious about it. So,
and thank you for being here, Dora. She lives in BC and is a wonderful writer herself. So, yeah.
Okay, then there's Melanie Matheson, who asks how you feel about middle grade genre, and are you planning on writing in that genre further?
Well, you know, I have the book that I'm writing right now is, I think, maybe for a little bit older than middle grade. And I have written a picture book for children that I haven't been able to get anybody to publish, but I actually have probably 3 or 4 picture books for kids that I've worked on. So yeah, I'm interested in writing for other age groups too. So.
Okay. So Dora wasn't finished her question when she she said, how did Peter have the money to stay in a hotel?
Well, she hasn't read the book.
Right.
So what happens, Dora, is that the railroad company feels so badly about what has happened to Peter that they give him a first-class ticket to go from Sisseton to Humboldt. And so he stays in the hotel on the railroad's coin. In fact, he gets a letter from the vice president of the railroad. And again, that's something, if he had been maybe an immigrant from another country, wouldn't have happened. But because he was an American citizen who had been whose family had been in the United States for some 30 years, he was, treated in a little different way. So
that's true. Are there any other questions that we have? Our Q&A box is empty.
Well, Harriet, if not, I might just do that screen share. And I had a few pictures to show of my grandfather that I'll see if I can do that now. And I'll just, is that working?
Yep.
So this is me with my grandpa Peter and my grandma Annie just shortly after I was born. They look pretty happy to have me in the world. And this is with my grandfather Peter out at the farm. And you can see the barn in the background. And I probably am about 3 years old there. This is the one picture I have of Grandpa as a young man. I think he's about 16. I would love to have a picture of Grandpa as a child, but all the people I've contacted about it, nobody has a picture of him as a child. I'm hoping that maybe somebody who reads the book will have some old family pictures of him. This is my grandparents on their wedding day. And in the book, I have them meet each other on a roller coaster, but they actually met each other at church in Drake when they were adults, Peter and Annie. But Annie is really my grandma's name, as is the girl that Peter meets in the book. And Grandma and Grandpa went on a 3-month honeymoon by train, which I think is so appropriate since the novel is set on a train. But this is a picture of them. I think they look just wonderful. They went from Regina, Saskatchewan, all the way to Vancouver, and then down to California, and then over to Kansas, and then back home. They got married on New Year's Day and spent 3 months traveling.
Wow.
And this is my Aunt Elma, my great Aunt Elma, whom I had never met. She wrote the memoir that gave me the inspiration for the book. And one of the wonderful things that's happened is that I have come in contact now with her granddaughter, Wendy, and we've become friends, and we exchange emails, and she sent me all these wonderful pictures of her grandmother. So this great aunt I never knew, I'm getting to know her too. And so I'm very grateful to great Aunt Elma, because if she had not written her memoir, I would not have my book. So that's it.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. That really adds a lot of flavor, right? Color, flavor to the story. Those are really valuable and pleasing. So well, okay, we have no more questions. Is there anything else you want to say about the writing process, about the book, your experience, this whole experience?
There we go. Well, I think one of the questions you had talked to me about is that you said it sort of seems like each chapter in the book is kind of an adventure, and had I planned that? And you know, I did actually. When I was writing it, I was thinking about how, like, my favorite time of the day when I was a teacher was that half hour when I sat down and read to the children. You know, and I did that whether I was teaching kindergarten or grade 12. I would read to them for half an hour, and that was my favorite time of being a mom too. Was the time when I would read to my sons before they went to bed. So I was trying to kind of think of that and make each chapter in the book sort of an adventure that was on its own, so that if you were reading it with children, you'd have that kind of encapsulated experience in each chapter. And I wrote it as an adventure story, and it was actually when I was going back and editing it that I started thinking about, like, all the things that Peter was learning and how he was growing as a person and becoming more self-confident and expanding his view of the world. And so I had him kind of reflect on that, but that kind of happened later. So, yeah.
Well, that's what a novel is. It's got to be its own world, but it's got to be a real world. And you've done that. As to each chapter, I mean, they're really nicely contained, skillfully constructed.
Oh, thank you.
But they flow one into the other, right? There's a natural progression, and quite enjoyable to read. And I'm really, really happy to see that it's been on the bestseller list. It's
that's been wonderful.
Bestseller list for so long.
I'd like to do some thank yous to people if there's time for that. I first, I want to thank everybody who came tonight, and I know there's a lot of you out there, and I just appreciate so much that you could be here. I was a little disappointed when I, realized that I wasn't going to be able to have a launch I'd always dreamed of at McNally's, but this is great because I know that, there are people here all the way from British Columbia to Halifax and in between. And so I'm really grateful that you're all here. And I'm really grateful that so many of you have bought my book. I appreciate it so much. I want to thank you, Harriet, because
no problem.
I just was so pleased when you said you'd do this. Thank you, Beryl, for introducing us. And thank you for all your great thought-provoking questions. So thank you so much. And I want to thank John Tates too at McNally's. And Monica Miller, my marketing manager from Heritage House, who kind of put this all together. And I'm so appreciative of that. I mean, I think we all know, what a fabulous job McNally's does of supporting local authors, but I didn't know just how fabulous till I published my own book. And it's just really, really remarkable. And it was so nice tonight not to have to worry about any of the technical things, any of the organization that John was taking care of all that. So thank you so much, McNally's. And like I say, my writers group met at McNally's. Every single chapter of this book was read out loud at the McNally Robinson bookstore. So for critique. So thank you to them. And And I just want to say that lots of people have approached me about, I've people from schools and libraries and museums and seniors' homes have approached me about coming out to talk about the book, and I would just love to do that. And so if your book club is interested in reading Lost on the Prairie, I would love to come and talk to you, and hopefully with the pandemic over, talk to you face to face about Lost on the Prairie. And I'm going to continue to publish things on my MaryLouDriedger.com about other things that happen with the novel, newsletters and blogs and so on. So you can keep track of things there. And just thanks again all for coming. And I just appreciate everybody's interest in the book so much.
There's one quick last question from
okay.
one person who says, and I think you've answered though, did your family ever talk about your grandfather's adventure, or did you just only discover it via your great aunt?
I just discovered it. Well, that's a good question. There were little bits. I knew my mother had told me that my grandfather had traveled to Canada in the train car with the horses. I knew that. And the reason she told me that was my mom and I once wrote a Christmas story together about what Christmas had been like when she was a little girl. And she was telling me about how they had gone to church in this sort of a sleigh. It's like a covered sleigh. And she said to keep warm, my mother heated up bricks to put under our feet. And then my dad wrapped us in horsehair blankets. And she said the blankets were made from the hides of Prince and Gypsy, which were the two horses that my dad had traveled with in the boxcar to Canada. So I knew that Grandpa had traveled in a boxcar, and I knew he'd traveled with the horses. And that's how I knew the horses' names, because my mom told me that, because she was wrapped in Prince and Gypsy's hides when she was a little girl. So I knew that part of the story, but I did not know the part of the story about Grandpa's train car becoming uncoupled. And of course, there's no one alive from that time. My Aunt Viola is 98, but I've talked to her about it, and she doesn't have a memory of that either. So yeah.
Well, you never stop finding things out, eh? It's just really very, very interesting. Well, this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's just been terrific. And I guess now we'll turn it back to John. Thank you everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thank you for your great questions. So John.
And thank you both very, very much. Just a few closing notes before I let you all loose into the evening. I will remind you that copies of Lost on the Prairie are available from McNally Robinson. I let you know all the various ways you can get them, but you can visit us, call us, order them online. We'll make sure a copy of this wonderful book gets to you. I'll also remind you this November, look out for Second Chances from Harriet Zaidman from Red Deer Press. That book is available for pre-order online, and we can make sure that a copy of that gets into your hand as well. I'd like to thank Monica at Heritage House for all of her help planning this evening. Couldn't have done it without you, and you brought together so wonderfully. To Harriet for your incredible hosting. I'm gesturing toward your box on my screen. And of course, to you, Mary Lou, for writing this book. Thank you so much, and for taking the time to share all the stories behind it. Jody mentioned that we could listen to you for hours, and it's true, the depth of the conversation and just revealing the history behind this book was fascinating. So thank you both very much for that. And thanks to all of you for joining us, for all of your questions, all of your comments, all of you here in the Zoom webinar, watching live on YouTube. I know there's quite a few of you out there. And just so that you know, this video will remain up on YouTube as well. So if you'd like to revisit it, or if you'd like to share it with somebody who wasn't able to make it here tonight, please do feel free to do so. The link to this video is just in the invitation you will have received. So without further ado, thank you all so very much once again. Have a lovely night.